in terms of one of the chapters, I found this interesting, mountains on my back. Why mountains on my back?
I'm shrinking. I'm literally shrinking. During my Ph.D, I shrunk about 2 inches. I had a voice come to me in that journey and said, "You carry the weight of the mountains on your back." And that's where that title comes from.
Hello, Caleb, and thank you so much for tuning in today and wanting to have a conversation with me. Welcome to PhD Hard Talk. Could you please introduce your research?
Sure. I am Dr. Caleb Pendygraft. I am currently an assistant professor in Massachusetts at a public university. My research in particular looks at LGBTQ literacy practices in the region of America called Appalachia. You ever heard of Appalachia? No?
No idea, but I will go on Google.
Yeah.
Google got me.
Appalachia is one of the, well, it's contested in geography anyways, but it's one of the oldest mountain ranges in the world. A lot of Scots and Irish came over during the settlement of America. And as they progressed west, they settled in the first mountain range they came to, and that was Appalachia. So it's it's the eastern part of the United States. It stretches from all the way up in Maine, New York, down to Georgia. So I don't know if you're familiar with the geography over here.
Yes, I am. I'm with you with Georgia and New York.
Okay.
We are together.
Yeah.
Continue.
So the mountains, in a number of ways, have been designated as a place of poverty, a place of illiteracy, especially back in the 50s and 60s. The Appalachian Regional Commission was developed as a mechanism to pump a lot of money into the economy. And because of that, and I'm sure you've been exposed to the stereotypes of like the hillbilly and the redneck.
Yes.
All of those stereotypes are very centralized in Appalachian culture. And so the community I belong to, the community of scholars, at least on the regional study side, really combats against those stereotypes. And so what my work does, because over here I'm in the English department and I study reading and writing, and that's what I got my PhD in, but it also intersects with Appalachian identity.
Okay.
And I'm particularly looking at sort of like the Venn diagram of how LGBTQ folks in the mountains use reading, writing, and language to survive, ultimately.
Amazing. So first things first, in terms of people out there, I'm not saying they don't know, but some people may not know. What is a public university where you are? What does that mean?
It is a state level government. It's funded by the state government, ultimately, is what it boils down to. Private universities are privately funded. So so for instance, I'm from Kentucky. I don't know if you've known, and I went to Northern Kentucky University for my undergrad, which was a public state school. And then I went to Miami University, which is also another public university in Ohio, for my graduate studies.
Okay.
And I got my PhD there. And then I moved all the way up north. I always tell my students whenever I introduce myself, I feel like a southern fish out of water up here a little bit.
There's great food there, isn't there? So that's a great balance.
Yeah, that's true.
So in terms of your research then, you've gone through the fact that you've looked at language and then you're looking at a certain group. Mm-hmm. What inspired you to focus on this research?
Yeah, so is it okay if I get a little personal here?
Of course.
I grew up in Appalachia, poor, homeless, queer, a survivor of rape and physical abuse. And one of the ways out that I navigated, not necessarily out of mountain culture per se, but out of those very precarious parts of my life was reading and writing and books. Really, it's what it boils down to.
Yeah.
Language was a catalyst that allowed me to survive, and that impetus has never left. I've always been curious how other queer mountain queers survive, and I took that with me to grad school. Here's a good story. I didn't know I was Appalachian until I wasn't. I had no idea. Yeah, had no idea. No.
Okay, talk to me. I'm moving close, you know. I like gossip as well.
Yeah, so when I was in grad school, my master's thesis, I was working through, so my early research was about how technologies enable people to find communities. Yeah. Particularly, I have a chapter coming out on embodied rhetorics and queer hookup apps, and how in rural areas it really facilitates community, right? Well, along that journey of research, I realized that there was a whole community of Appalachian researchers, and it just clicked one day that I'm from this area. I'm Appalachian, and I had no idea. And so that just set, it just opened up. Everything was clear from that point forward that my research questions, I can't be the only queer in the mountains who use language to survive. And ever since then, that's what I've been doing. I collect oral histories from mountain queers, Appalachian queers, however that they fall underneath those umbrellas, you know. And that's where I'm at now. And that's what my my first book is going to be about. It's set for 2025. All of my dissertation research is sort of funneled into that, and I'm working on it and keep going.
Well, amazing. Congratulations on the book. Please share it with me so I can read and share and share, literally. And congratulations on finding out who you are, in the sense of, I mean, this will come out as a shock, and I don't mean it disrespectfully to anyone out there. I didn't know I was Black until I started working. You know, I knew I was Black, but no one told me what Black means until I started working. So I understand. It may not be the same, but I think I understand what you're saying, because when the penny dropped, it opened a lot of avenues, because I didn't see myself in that way. So congratulations on that.
You too. Yeah. I mean, that's I think part of the journey of research and study, right? Like you start, things open up, you know, and we can certainly relate to each other in that way. That's awesome.
Definitely. Back to linguism, which is your area. So in terms of the study then, what have you found out that can help those who are still back home?
You mean in terms of the individuals that my community, or PhD students?
So let's go to community, and then we'll come back to PhD students, and then your journey as well.
Yeah. So I am one of the steering committee members for the Appalachian Studies Association. Excellent. And it emerged in, I want to say the 70s. Don't hold me against that history. I'm not, I forget when the association formed. It was either the 70s or 80s. And it emerged because of scholars really speaking up and against these national narratives here in the state that everybody are from the mountains are backwards, hillbillies, they're unintelligent, they, you know, can't read, they can't write. And so I feel more at home in that community. And by joining that community, I've realized that there is, and this is getting to your question, you just needed some context, I guess, but belonging to that community, I gave a presentation on a recent chapter that came out 2 years ago, and a bunch of LGBTQ folks in the audience just came up and just started telling stories, right? Starting sharing, like, I struggled that way too, or I experienced this, and it really clicked that Appalachian queers have a lot to say And reading, writing, language itself has been a means of accessing both a local level, but also state and national level too. I don't know if you are aware of, there's an Instagram feed called Queer Appalachia.
Oh no, I didn't know, but I'll look into it.
There's some politics that are sort of around, some shady stuff went down, but nevertheless, technology, I'm using that as an example to show like people have been using social media, these online venues to make very visible the literacy practices of queers in the region. And so my advice is to speak up, make yourself seen when it's safe to do so, because I know that there's, you know, your body and you have to take in your bodily safety, but looking to my community, you're not alone, we're not alone, and the world is moving in the direction where Appalachia and queerness can be cohabitate in more visible, viable ways. We've always been there. Queers have been in the mountains since we arrived, right? Like, but the direction we're headed, it's certainly more viable. It is most definitely more community-based than it has ever been. And the more that we talk, the more that we ask hard questions, the more that we get involved with local politics. And one big thing for Appalachia is land rights, because the mountains have been so abused from capitalism. The more that we can speak up and against that kind of behavior, the more community we can build. Did that answer your question?
It does. And moving on from that, in terms of your work then, I'm being general again, do you feel that you're writing to promote and also to encourage policymakers to do better for your community? Or do you feel like it's more on, you know, you are publishing, you're having these forums where people can talk, but the movement is still slow and you would want it to move a bit quicker? Where are you now?
So my imagined audience isn't necessarily policymakers, I would say. It isn't geared towards legislative or governing bodies. What I would really, when I imagine somebody picking up my work, I want people who don't think that queers belong to come to that realization. That we're here, we have been here, and we're not going anywhere.
So how does one come to that realization then?
Hopefully by reading our work.
Well, there must be something, you know, a special line or something that you've documented that you feel will open people's eyes.
Well, see, I'm probably I'm one of maybe 15 scholars who is actually looking at the intersections of Appalachia and queerness. One thing that we are doing beyond just our publication is actually creating community outreach committees and programs, and working with the universities in the Appalachia region. We are building youth groups. I know of some people doing like diversity, inclusion, and equity work with high school students and undergraduate students. So that, I think, if I understand you correctly, that's one way that we're reaching a general public outside of academia. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, a lot of sense. Moving on to your role with students then, when you are educating, how does one transition from, this is my personal story,
Sure.
I've lived it and I'm still enjoying this, however, I need to educate everybody. How do you transition from the person and also to being an educator? Or do you not transition at all?
So you're saying, how do I, as an individual, sort of take all the multi-layered identity aspects and as a pedagogue, perhaps? I hope that those two things aren't separate. That's personally, I make it a point, and I, because I teach English,
Yeah.
writing, literature, communication, I always tell my students, I'm going to approach this in a way that my colleagues might not. I'm interested in your ideas, but that is only second to who you are. So let's start with who you are in the classroom. What knowledge do you bring? Because we're all built of story, right? Everything that we are as individuals is a story. And I am more concerned first with the stories you bring into our classroom. Once we get a firm grasp on who we are, then we can deal with what do I know and what do I want to know, right? So in terms of philosophy, because my undergraduate, I have a philosophy background too, I start with ontology first before we moved into epistemologies. Yeah. I think our bodies carry stories with them. Who we are is made of stories. And so to answer your question, I don't think that you can separate the two. I think we should make it more of a focus in our classroom, because if we can grapple with our stories as individuals, we can see difference between each other, not as something that is detrimental, right? But something to nurture and cherish and sort of cultivate in the classroom. Whereas if I were to bring in your ideas first, then we might get some tension and we might start some conflict where it's not necessary.
Yeah. No, excellent. I guess what I was trying to get at here is for you to educate the wider audience in terms of your choices and why you make them and why they are strategic in terms of opening people's eyes, going back to what you've done for the community and what you are still doing, and when educating as well what your stance is, because I feel that is important.
Yeah.
Otherwise you won't be writing what you write, because I find it interesting. Personally, but I studied English language and literature for my A levels, so maybe that's why it's exciting to me. But I want everybody else to be excited, in that sense. So, in terms of your research, then, I've read through what you sent us, and I guess what I wanted to focus on is the methodology that you chose to follow. So could you please take me through your choices and why you made them?
Sure. So before I can really expound upon why my methodology is very queer in its approach, I think you have to understand to a certain extent the research questions that I'm asking. So a lot of my theoretical basis comes from a fusion of queer theory, sort of coupled with new materialism. When I say new materialism, it's a post-humanist practice that says things outside of the human are as equally important to the way that we understand meaning making, we understand how significance comes to be. And so part of that is important. Well, my research site then takes on more importance, right? In Appalachia, the land is equally as important as the participants.
Yes.
Right. So in the mountains, you might belong to one holler, you might be above the Mason-Dixon or below it. And I know these are very Americanized terms or cultural signaling here, but that led me to my methodology, which says I only qualify, I have two qualifiers, and however you fall underneath those umbrellas, I'm perfectly fine. They have to be adults, and they have to belong to Appalachia somehow. Whether that, well, my family's from there, we moved away because, my great-grandmother needed a job, right? So we call it the expats out of, there's such thing as the Appalachian migration into the Midwest when the coal dried up. Again, things here, right? The land has a significance. And then they have to be queer and however they find themselves underneath that umbrella. Lesbian, gay, bi, trans, pan. I have some participants who are in queer relationships, but they're like polyamorous, right? So that's a various, that's something outside of heteronormativity.
Yes.
but my methodology is informed by taking things, the tangible world around us, the places we belong, of equal importance to the humans that belong there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a queer new materialist approach into the way that I'm understanding literacy in the region.
It's quite interesting. I guess maybe I'm reaching here. It sounds like a bit like anthropology, you know, like in terms of observation of the external and internal, because usually they do tally up, but you're not actually sitting there and observing these people for like 3 years, but you're actually using culture and reality versus inward reality, if that makes sense. And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And part of what I have to be careful with is, one, any drafts that I go through, my participants have full range of editorial input. Like if they don't like the way that I write about their stories or have written about them, they're very much part of the revision process. So that's another methodological choice that, because I get what you're saying, you know, anthropology has this sort of insider-outsider dichotomy that is almost in some ways very unethical, or it can be.
Yeah.
Can be, I should couch that. And as an insider myself, I like to think that I'm writing with my participants and through their stories, not merely writing about them. Does that make sense?
No, it does make sense. And that is empowering the community itself and giving them the voice. That's why we're on PhD Hard Talk. See what I did?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
But in terms of one of the chapters, I found this interesting, but I guess because I write poetry, I could see where you were going with it. Mountains on my back.
Yeah.
Prologue. Why mountains on my back? Because without having to read, I'm thinking, right, you've gone through some really crappy moments.
Yes.
That's what I'm thinking. But I'm sure you've got a definition for that is better worded than going through a lot of crap.
Yeah. So there is definitely, we call it trials and tribulations.
Yes,
that I've gone through.
We call it.
And so maybe I should preface what I'm about to say with the fact that I grew up in a Pentecostal church, but at the same time, I grew up, and this has been very difficult for me. I have an article coming out in the spring called "Coming Out the Broom Closet."
Okay.
It's about queer Appalachian witches in the mountains.
Oh.
And it's about paganism that has been in the region, but there hasn't been a spotlight on it. And so, to my knowledge, I'm one of the first scholars to really, one, position myself as a queer witch from Appalachia.
Yeah.
And secondly, to create a theoretical basis for an understanding of why paganism might be a way to preserve the mountains for the future. And it's a queer way. I mean, because we see the interconnectedness of things.
Yeah.
We don't see the divine as something far off.
Yeah.
So I'm telling you this because that gestures towards why I named that prologue Mountains on My Back. And it's tentative, right? Like these are all tentative titles. It's still in the drafting phase. But when I was young, my dad's side of the family, very religious. They were Baptist, but my mom and I, it was just me and my mom growing up. And we were the Pentecostal ones. And I went to stay with my grandparents. And we were getting ready for church. I hated going to church. It was absolutely, oh God, it was awful. I hated it. And so, but I'll remember this one morning. My papa was sitting in his recliner. He had just delivered himself some insulin. We were getting ready for church, and he looks outside. He lived up on we call them knobs, like the part of the region is the Kentucky knobs. He sort of built his house into one of those knobs, leveled some land, but they kept a pond, kind of kept part of it. And he was like, "Caleb, you believe if you have faith, the grain of a mustard seed, you could move that mountain out there. And at the time, you know, I was like, yeah, I do. And because I loved my papa. I mean, I wanted to make him happy, you know, and I really believed with every little iota of you know, 6-year-old Caleb that he
yeah, that was there. You could do all things, literally.
So I prayed. I prayed every time I came to his house. I prayed that that mountain would get up and move. But I stopped praying. I stopped going over there. I stopped being straight. I stopped letting that side of the family physically abuse me and beat me. And one day, my first year of college, I kept having these terrible dreams. Awful dreams about my grandfather. I'm in his house and I can't find him. I'm looking, I'm searching everywhere. He's gone. And the dreams just wouldn't stop. I mean, it was like a reoccurring nightmare over and over. So I said, hell with it. I hadn't seen them in 8 years. And so I decided to drive down to that area, right? Down to my grandparents. And when I got there, my granny was on the porch sweeping off the leaves. There was a big storm that I drove through. I remember it flooded. I remember seeing a trailer floating down the river. It was that bad. But I was, by God, I was going to go see my grandfather, right? And so I get there and I'm like, Granny, you know who this is? And she cried and I cried. And I was like, I've been having these bad dreams about Papa. I came to see him. She stood there. She took a deep breath. And she said, Caleb, did you not hear? I said, hear what? She said, we buried him yesterday. And I looked up and guess what was gone? The mountain was gone. It was gone. The dream stopped and I went along with my life.
Oh my gosh.
So
no words. Wow.
And so I came out to my granny that day. We had a hard talk. And she told me, well, you can still come around. You just don't have to bring that part of your life. And I'm like, but that is my life.
Yeah. How does one not bring that part of their life?
Exactly. So I made a decision that day that I made I met him in the middle. I made my amends and I moved on. So when I was in my PhD program, so flash forward probably about, oh gosh, 10 years. And this is where the title of the chapter comes from. I'm a proud pagan. I worship the earth.
Yeah.
I think that we are whole unto ourselves. We don't need dogma to tell us that we're divine. And I was doing a drumming. There was a drum circle and we were doing journeying.
Yeah.
I had in that mental space, whatever you call it, whether you want to call it in your psyche, your third eye, however you want to.
I mean, there's so much terminology out there, isn't there? But the third eye is the one that's used the most, isn't it? Yeah.
But I had just a message delivered, and it said, the reason you have a bad spine, or I'm shrinking. I'm literally shrinking. I've shrunk. You want to hear? Here's a good story for your channel. During my Ph.D., I shrunk. My graduate work, I shrunk about 2 inches. And I had a voice come to me in that journey and said, you carry the weight of the mountains on your back. And that's where that title comes from.
Oh, okay.
So I know it might not be the
direct questions.
That's all in the book. I mean, it's about how we navigate and how, you know, I'd argue that if it wasn't for my papaw and that really harsh Christianity, the discipline, the all the Bible being there, how I had to endure, how I knew what Bible verse he was talking about. Like, literacy enabled me to have a relationship with my grandfather. It allowed me to pray in the same way that he prayed. And whether it caused a mountain to move or not, I have no idea, but I don't think that's the point, right?
Yeah.
So looking back over my life, I've carried those mountains on my back. And that's what this book is about. It's about how do other people carry the mountains with them? How do other queers carry their stories of queer survival in Appalachia?
That is amazing. And I have to say, it's not just about people in the US or in Appalachia. Globally, there's so many people. And the other thing is, I wanted to say, is Shakespeare, when he was writing, and I know you know this, but it's just for the audience. You know, he went to church, allegedly, based on research, and his work reflects the word of God, measure for measure. You can see the scriptures, Luke, you know, everything is there. So, you know, what you're saying, you're not the first person, but you're the first person in current modern day to bring it to light in full view in a way that we understand, instead of thou and art and all that stuff, because no one really likes Shakespeare like that nowadays. Well, maybe some people do.
Sure, there's a lot of, you know, Shakespearean scholars out there. So.
Yeah, so I totally got that. That's why I wanted you to explain in terms of, I can see your influences through writing. Again, that's just due to the fact that I've studied literature. And thank you so much for sharing. I guess in terms of advice for somebody who's gone through a similar journey, but they're in a country where genuinely they can't come out, and they are trying to write, as you know, when we look at rural areas, as you've explained, usually in certain parts of the world, they're villages, or they're known as squatter camps in that sense. So what advice would you have for somebody that's coming from that background?
That's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, as a literacy scholar, putting words down in an environment like that, in a culture like that, can be a matter of life and death. You know, gotta be very mindful about how you are communicating those signals, how queerness is sort of rendered on your body. And if it's not rendered on the page somehow, my advice, gosh, find a community. The first thing, and that even seems precarious as well, right? Like, that's almost, how do you reach out? I don't know if I have those answers, but I know it wasn't just reading and writing that saved my life, but it was through reading and writing that I found others with similar experiences to me that helped me the most, perhaps, you know that I'm not alone, because ultimately that's what part of the human complex is, right? Like, wanting to feel belonged to a group, to feel seen and to feel heard. It's hard. I don't know if I have simple answers for that.
Yeah, it is a complex issue, and I guess, and also it's quite sensitive, especially if you know that is a matter of life and death. But my advice would be for them to try and get your book. Maybe they may be able to re-strategize and find a way to network, as you've networked as well, haven't you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so there may be a way, or, you know, going to university to move out of that part of the world.
Education is a critical part of my journey. I know if it wasn't for the teachers and scholars in my life who were like, we'll hold you up, you know, we'll lift you up. If I could just return a little bit of that in my life to somebody, I think I've done good on this earth, you know? Yeah.
No, that is amazing. And that's not to say everybody should, you know, inbox you and ask for money. Help is not just monetary wise, you know. Disclaimer. But in terms of the next steps then, when it comes to you being a researcher, a professor and an author, what are your next steps in the next 5 years?
Well, I just signed the book contract for the proposal that I shared with you.
Yes.
So that's under contract. And then what was really fortunate, and it kind of fell in my lap, and I'm grateful to my ancestors. I'm grateful for the opportunity, really. But I also signed a second book contract.
Oh, get it? Wow. No, hold on. Has to be right. Congratulations. Wow.
Yeah, it was on Appalachian paganism.
Yeah.
I know it sounds kind of surreal, but like the article that is coming out in the spring has, by taking that risk, by coming out of the broom closet, right?
Yeah.
Creating an opportunity, a space for a publication that hasn't been written on. And so I will be writing, once this book is through, I'll be working, hopefully have tenure.
Yeah.
But I'll be working on my second book on Appalachian paganism. So that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, that is amazing. And, you know, in terms of coming out of the closet, whichever way you're coming out, it's always a difficult process. And to educate people based on true stories and true events, it's always monumental. So what you're doing is amazing. And there is a group somewhere, maybe in Cuba, you know, or maybe in China, that wants to come out, but it doesn't have to be the same title, but it may be something else. It may not be the same emotion, but it may be a different feeling, if you understand what I mean. So whichever way you look at it, what you're doing is powerful, and it is a movement, and it's radical. I love it.
Thanks.
And you are Pentecostalian.
There, I have Pentecostal.
So being radical is a part of you. So, you know, keep doing what you're doing. Yeah. It's amazing. So, any parting words for anybody out there?
If you're safe enough to take risks, that's the only way we can grow. Take risks, make bold choices. I wouldn't have found the perfect interdisciplinary job if I wasn't willing to put my 3 kitties in the back seat and drive across the country to the East Coast. You know, it was scary. It's going to be scary. PhDs are scary with scary stuff. But taking risks pays off, even when they don't. You learn a lot about yourself in the process. As long as you can do it safely and it causes no one harm, including yourself, I think don't be afraid, or face down that fear if you have it, and go for it. Dream big. I know that sounds trite, but you know, sometimes you have to have a huge dream in front of you to actually go for it.
Yeah, and I guess to add on to your point is knowledge is power. If you don't know the lexicons, the root word, etc., you know, you are at a disadvantage every time you have a conversation with somebody, because what you think they mean sometimes is not what they mean, and you have to understand the context. And the context of today is to say dream big and, you know, go for it. But breathing is a risk as well. Now there's COVID-19.
That's very true. Very true.
So, but one more question, and then I will let you go. Why come on PhD Hard Talk?
Well, why not?
Why not?
You know, you reached out to me, and I think it's important that PhD students, those who are recently awarded their degrees, postdocs, assistant professors, we need to put our stories out there. We belong to a community, even if it's unseen. And who's going to validate our work if we don't share our stories, right? And so this was an opportunity to share, to build community.
And that's the way forward. And that's all we want, for everybody to have a voice, to be heard, and to educate, and also to give back to the communities in which we conduct the research in, because they are people at the end of the day. So thank you again for your time today, Dr. Caleb Pendygraft. Don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and share, and get our voices out there. And please do purchase Caleb's book when it comes out. We'll have all the information at the bottom in terms of the links. Follow him on Twitter, LinkedIn. If you still want to have a conversation, he's available, but he's booked and busy, so don't expect him back just like that. You know, he's a busy man. But thank you again.
Thanks. I appreciate it.